Ladies and gentlemen, once again, welcome to this very special segment on the 17th day of March, and very soon we'll be joining Okay, there goes the bell. So we will soon be joining the Parliament and the parliamentary session for the Queensland Parliament today, and later on we will be bringing to you the Daily India report and all of those reports in the second part of the segment. But first of all, we'll join in with the Queensland Parliament as the sitting for today, the 17th day of March, begins. And the weather today, 25 degrees and sunny, and it is wonderful to see the sun out once again. It is beautiful. The river's looking pretty good at the moment. Of course, you can see the few debris floating on the river, but it's what's underneath and all around. So here's the Parliament session about to begin.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Honourable members, I respectfully acknowledge that we are sitting today on the land of Aboriginal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I thank them as First Australians for their careful custodianship of the land over countless generations. We are indeed fortunate in this country to have two of the world's oldest continuing living cultures in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose lands, winds and waters we all now share. Are there any matters of privilege? I call the member for Mermaid Beach.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The three LNP members of the Economics and Governance Committee boycotted this morning's scheduled meeting. We do not take this action lightly. However, we will not be silenced or allow our silence to become misrepresented by the failing of the portfolio system, which allows 4 votes of government members to 3 votes of non-government members.
Order! Members, I don't need any assistance. I ask member for Mermaid Beach if you can point to a particular standing order which is relevant to this being a matter of privilege. Otherwise, I'll ask you to resume your seat.
It would be under Standing Order 211, Mr. Speaker, that the LNP members of the Economics and Governance Committee are totally committed to honesty, openness and transparency for the public interest of matters.
Member, I'm going to ask member that you get to the point, or you write to me. Yeah. Because this is
Speaker, I shall be writing to you to outline what we believe are.
No, member, no, thank you, acting leader of the House. I do not. This is not an opportunity to have a platform to speak about the issue.
I will be writing to you, Mr. Speaker.
I appreciate that, and I look forward to receiving that correspondence. Order! Order! Thank you, Premier. Honourable members, the Legislative Assembly's standing orders exist to ensure that we have a framework with which the Assembly can carry out its responsibilities. A fundamental responsibility of this Assembly is to scrutinise the activities of government. An important way that all members participate in this role is by asking questions of the government about its policies and its administration. Unfortunately, there has been an increase in disputation in relation to questions on notice and responses. This has led to an increased pressure on the resources of Parliament. I take this opportunity to remind all members of my expectations in respect of questions on notice and ministerial responses to those questions. Some members, unfortunately, require this advice more than others. Some key points of this advice need to be explicitly stated, which I will now do. In relation to questions, I shall consider questions which contain gratuitous political statements as argumentative, and such questions will be ruled out of order. Furthermore, Misleading the House via a question or notice is just as unacceptable as doing so in the chamber. Members must take care to ensure that questions are not argumentative and do not contain inferences or imputations or wrongdoing or factual inaccuracies. In relation to answers, as long as the question accords with standing orders and is genuinely seeking to elicit information which should be available to the Minister, I will rule that the Minister should answer the question in a relevant and genuine manner. In 2021, there were a steady number of complaints that responses did not answer the question asked. Approximately 2% of answers to questions on notice asked in 2021 have been the subject of complaints. Approximately 1% of answers to questions on notice asked in 2021 have required amendment from their initial answer to be compliant with standing orders. These may seem like low numbers, but the tax on resources is high. Responses must pertain to the question asked. If not, they are irrelevant and the question will be considered unanswered. Answers which contain gratuitous political statements that are not relevant to the question asked will be ruled out of order. As stated above, questions on notice and answers to the same which contain gratuitous political statements are out of order. Simply put, political attacks which are superfluous to putting a question on notice or answering the same will be considered gratuitous political statements. Questions on notice and their answers by their nature are premeditated. And members, I want the House to consider this. The latitude given to off-the-cuff contributions in the House, particularly in a time like question time, is important, but it does not apply to the questions on notice process. As I said, the process is considerably premeditated. So when I'm asked to make determinations that questions on notice and or answers thereof are compliant under standing orders, I will apply previous Speaker's rulings and the principles enunciated in this statement. I seek leave to incorporate a full statement about this matter circulated in my name. Is leave granted? Leave is granted. Honourable members, on the 20th of December 2021, the member for Capalaba wrote to me alleging that the member for South Brisbane reflected on the Speaker in a Facebook post on the 3rd of December 2021. The matter relates to comments made on Facebook by the member for South Brisbane discussing the motion of dissent that the member for South Brisbane gave notice on the 18th of November 2021 and was debated in the House on the 1st of December 2021. Specifically, the Facebook post of the member for South Brisbane described the ruling as, quote, flawed. The member for Capalaba argued that the referring to a ruling of the Speaker as flawed, the member for South Brisbane was calling a ruling of the Speaker a defect or a fault, and as such made a reflection on the Chair. I sought further information from the member for South Brisbane about the allegation made against her in accordance with Standing Order 2695. The member for South Brisbane submitted that she was not making assertions that I had acted in bad faith or in a partial manner. Rather, she was summarising the motion of dissent as part of her 2020 parliamentary summary to her constituents. Standing Order 2694 requires that in considering whether a matter should be referred to the Ethics Committee, that I should take into account the degree of importance of the matter which has been raised and whether an adequate apology or explanation has been made in respect to the matter. Standing Order 26623 is clear that if members comment or reflect on a decision of the Chair, except by substantive motion of censure, this is a clear example of contempt. This reflects the long-standing parliamentary practice in Westminster parliaments. I caution the member for South Brisbane that the member should take care in her commentary about the rulings of the Chair to avoid committee contempt of the House. But I consider that this matter hinges on the use of a single word, flawed, which is not inherently offensive, and I consider the matter ultimately trivial, does not require the attention of the Ethics Committee, and I will not be referring the matter to that committee. I table the correspondence in relation to this matter. Finally, members, I wish to advise that we will be visited in the gallery this morning by students and teachers from Sanford State School in the electorate of Pine Rivers and Clontarf Beach State School in the electorate of Redcliffe. Are there any appointments to be announced? I call the Premier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I move that this House desires to place on record its appreciation of the services rendered to this state by the late Robert Henry Dolan, a former member of the Parliament of Queensland. that Mr Speaker be requested to convey to the family of the deceased gentleman the above resolution, together with an expression of the sympathy and sorrow of the members of the Parliament of Queensland in the loss they have sustained. Mr Speaker, Bob Dolan was born in Kyogle, New South Wales on the 6th of December 1928. He moved to Queensland in 1944 and worked extensively in the timber industry, including at times as the director of sawmills in central Queensland and the Wide Bay. Timber cutting as a young man would not have been an easy life, but he persevered and rose in the industry. Bob's knowledge of the timber industry, especially on the Fraser Coast, was second to none, which he carried into his parliamentary service. My father Henry remembers learning more about trees from Bob Dolan than he thought was humanly possible. On a trip to timber regions, Mr Dolan pointed out all the species, where they grew, which ones grew best on slopes, which ones grew best on flat ground, where logging had occurred, anything his fellow MPs needed to know. Mr Speaker, 1989 was a landmark year for the government in Queensland and for Bob Dolan. He was pre-selected by the Labor Party to contest the seat of Maryborough at what turned out to be an historic state election. Maryborough had an interesting history. It was a Labor seat for much of the 20th century until Gil Allison won it for the Liberal Party in 1971. Brendan Hanson won it back for Labor in 1977 before Allison returned in 1983, this time for the National Party. Then on that momentous day in Queensland political history, the 2nd of December 1989, Bob Dolan was able to win Maryborough. And so he played his part in helping Wayne Goss to form the first ALP government in this state for 32 years. Yeah. Mr Dolan won again in 1992 and 1995, serving as a member of this House for almost 9 years until the state election of June 1998. It's not surprising that during his first speech in this place, Mr Dolan spoke passionately and with great insight about the timber industry. I also note that during that first speech, Mr Dolan spoke about Walkers Limited of Maryborough, nowadays Downer. He spoke about the company's importance locally as a manufacturing hub and a major supplier of railway rolling stock to Queensland Rail. Mr Speaker, when I consider his legacy and his standing in the Maryborough community, it gives me great pride to mention our commitment to the largest rail investment in Queensland history, to build 65 trains, creating 800 jobs in Maryborough and the Wide Bay region, and up to 3,000 jobs throughout the state. Yeah. I hope and trust that Mr Dolan would have been proud as well. Yeah. Mr Speaker, Mr Dolan's service to the House included the Select Committee on Travel Safe from 1990 to 1998, a lengthy period on that important committee. And from 1992 to 1995, he was a member of Premier Goss's Rural and Northern Task Force. Mr Speaker, Robert Henry Dolan passed away on the 5th of November last year, a month before his 93rd birthday. A service to celebrate his life was held at the Bayside Memorial Gardens in Hervey Bay. Mr Speaker, the current member for Maryborough describes Bob Dolan as a Labor legend who was his mentor. Yeah. Knowing the member as we do, that's high praise indeed. Yeah. We know that anyone who qualified as the member for Maryborough's mentor must have been an outstanding person. Yeah. I place on record the government's thanks for the years of service that Bob Dolan gave to Queensland. And on behalf of the government, I extend my sympathy and that of this House to Mr Dolan's family and friends, to his wife Burley and their children Stephen, Stewie, Marie, Michelle and Katrina. And I welcome their granddaughter Penny with us today. Yeah. Mr Speaker, Bob Dolan lived a long and fruitful life of hard work and dedicated community service. I know he was greatly loved in the region. His family can be immensely proud. Maryborough will always be grateful, and our state is the better for his life.
Yeah. I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, it's always a matter for deep regret when this House is called upon to express its condolences on the passing of a former member. Sometimes it seems even more significant when the former member came into this place at a time of significant social, political and cultural change in this state. In this instance, I refer of course to the passing of Robert Bob Dolan, a former member for Maryborough who entered this House upon the election of the Goss government in 1989. In that capacity, he joined a generation of members who were able to say that they helped generate a range of changes and reforms. Bob Dolan represented the electorate of Maryborough from 1989 to 1998. Maryborough had been represented by the ALP from 1932 until 1971 and by both the Liberal and National parties until Bob Dolan's election. It's interesting to note that Bob Dolan's campaign director in his first election was Brendan Hanson, a predecessor in the seat of Maryborough and the former federal member for Wide Bay. Bob Dolan was very much a part of his local community. Much of his working life was involved with the timber industry, one of the mainstays of the local Maryborough economy. In his maiden speech in March 1990, he spoke of the need to increase the amount of land available for plantation timber as increased demand for housing put pressure on timber supplies. He spoke at length of the problems for those seeking housing if timber resources were shut up rather than being properly managed, and he warned of the activities of those seeking to close the timber industry. As member for Maryborough, Bob Dolan was equally vociferous in his advocacy for the other significant industries in the city: engineering, particularly the local firm Walkers, and sugar milling, as undertaken by the Maryborough Sugar Factory. In the latter case, he drew attention to the potential conflict between the sugar industry and the broader community as competition for scarce land and water resources continued to grow. Bob Dolan acknowledged that Maryborough was undergoing significant change. The number of factories and processing plants and manufacturers was in decline, unemployment was growing and job opportunities were declining. He expressed the hope that the incoming government would respond to these challenges and restore Maryborough's future. Bob Dolan's time in this House came to an end at the 1998 election when he was one of 6 ALP members to lose his seat to One Nation. Despite the premature conclusion of this parliamentary career, he was able to look back with pride on his advocacy for the electorate and its people. I did not know Bob Dolan personally, but I suspect few could summarise his life better than a former colleague from the timber industry who described him on social media, and I quote, as a great boss, a great mate and an absolute gentleman. The opposition extends our condolences to Bob Dolan's wife Verley, his children, his grandchildren, including Penny Liedersdorf, who joins us today, as well as his great-grandchildren, and we join in support of this motion.
Mr Speaker.
I call the member for Maryborough.
Mr Speaker, I rise today to talk about one of my mentors and a great man in the Maryborough electorate, Bobby Dolan. We didn't call him Robert, we call him Bobby, and he kept it very quiet that he's born in New South Wales for many years also. I first met Bob as a young man when I joined the Australian Labor Party branch in Maryborough, and Bob was coming and going in his timber industry those days. And to be honest, I didn't know Bob was a Labor man because most of the timber industries were old Nats. And Bob was. I started to get to know Bob very well. And when you got to know Bob, and the Leader of the Opposition was correct, he was a fantastic boss, and you started talking to men and women who worked for him, and they talked about how good he was, and then you realised the true Labor values of this man, how he treated his workers. And when I returned in 1989, I was living in Mount Isa, and the Goss government was elected, and the then member for Mount Isa, Tony McGrady, invited me down, and I had a few ales in the house here with the member for Maryborough, and we were talking after, and he was telling me about the future of Maryborough and the way he wanted to go with the timber and the industry and things like that. After the devastating loss in 1998, I was called back through Maryborough, and I was talking to Bob, and we saw the decline in the great city of Maryborough after Bob Dolan, and very graciously the Premier's father stepped up as a pseudo-member after 1998 until he retired from, and he was sort of the shadow member for Maryborough and kept Maryborough alive until those days. But Bob was one of the best men you'll ever meet. And one thing about Bobby Dolan was he's a man of his word. He didn't have to have a contract, he didn't have to write anything down. Bob shook your hand or Bob told you, that was it. So I rang him, and when I went back to Maryborough we kept in touch, and then in 2014 I rang him up and I said, Bob, I'm thinking about running for Maryborough. Oh, he said, we better have a talk. So I went and we caught up a few times, and he said to me, and he gave me some really good advice about winning the seat, and we followed that advice, and that's why the Palaszczuk government came to power. And then I thought I'd have a talk to Bob about timber. 4 days later I was still there talking about timber. And as the Premier said, every time I want to know about timber, and the member for Gympie will see this, I bring Bobby up. And you'd have about 15, 20 minutes spare in the office, but an hour and a half later you're still on the phone talking about timber. There's not a man I know who knew about timber like Bob Dolan, and he could tell you, as the Premier said, the leaves, the trees, the country it grew in, what they used it for, and every time we talked about timber at a branch meeting, you could see people starting to go, looking at their watches, because we knew this wasn't going to be a 10-minute talk. But Bob was a tremendous member, and I said in the adjournment when Bob passed away, I ran into a bloke at the markets one day, and he said to me, "I made 2 mistakes in life, mate." And I said, "Oh, what's that?" He said, "I got a tip about the Melbourne Cup, and I didn't back the horse." And he said, "And I voted against Bobby Dolan because Downer Rail, or Walkers as it was called those days, when Bob was the member, had 772 staff. It went down to 122. And he said to me, I was one of the blokes who lost my job. He said, and we didn't realise we had a fighter like Bob Dolan as our member. He said, we thought we could do that protest vote and go with Pauline Hanson to show the Labor Party what we thought of them." He said, "It taught me a lesson." He said, "It cost me my job," and he said, "Nearly cost me my home." So when you look at blokes like Bobby, and I said to you before, Mr Speaker, they broke the mould when a man like Bobby Dolan, he's well respected in Maryborough. And you look at his family, and his family are absolutely brilliant. They're good people. Bob was a good man, and his wife Verley. Bob married Verley in 1966. And besides trees, Verley was his next love, and you know, Verley is a tremendous woman. We're going to miss Bob, the Labor members and the union members of our area, because I missed him. He ran the Burrum booth for me all the time, and I'd say, "Bob, you're getting a bit long in the tooth, old mate. You can, you have to run it all day if you want it." He'd be there. He'd be set up at 6 o'clock in the morning. He'd be still there, counting the votes at 9 o'clock at night, And I mean, we're talking about a man who was in his late 70s, 80s, and Bob would be there, and everyone who came in at Burrum Heads he knew, and then he'd go down and we'd go down to the Speaker's Corner, they called it, Bob used to call it, at the beachfront at Burrum Heads, and every day he'd be there lecturing to people about the values of the Labor Party, the values of the timber industry. And the Premier came to town, we had a cabinet meeting in Maryborough, and the Premier said Maryborough was back to a timber town, a timber and train town. And I've never seen a bloke stand so tall was when the Premier announced that Maryborough was back as a timber town, because that was Bobby's dream, to be recognised again as the timber city of Queensland. We're going to miss Bobby. Every day I walk into my office, I've got a call through to Bobby Dolan on my wall, because think of the great things he did in the 9 years that he was the member for Maryborough. A man of his word, and a man that I'm proud to say that he stood for the Labor values. He stood for the values that we stand for in the Labor Party and the union movement. And you only had to look at that at his funeral, and the ex-workers who were coming up and talking, and his electorate officer Adele was talking about some of the days, some of the meetings they had. And I was talking to one of his ex-workers, and I was just saying to Penny's granddaughter, Bobby used to, Friday afternoon, they used to knock off work and go and have a few beers, and Bobby would take all the workers down. I don't know if that's OH&S today, but it was pretty good those days. But he's a fine man. Maryborough's going to miss him. He was one of what we call in our Labor area, we respect our Labor elders in the Wide Bay, and particularly the Maryborough electorate, Labor legends, and we've only got one left now, which is Maryborough's First Lady, Mrs Moya Hanson. But Bobby was one of our Labor legends, and everyone misses him. Particularly me, every time I need timber advice now, I don't know who to turn to, because I used to be able to talk to Bobby. But Speaker, I just want to pass my condolences on, as I have to the family. It's great to have Penny here today, and Penny was telling me what a great grandfather he was. Well, he was a good man for his community, a good family man, and I just wish that we had more in society like Bob Dolan. And from the Maryborough ALP and all the union people in my electorate, we like to say to the family, we're going to miss Bob Dolan.
I call the acting leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to add a few brief words in support of the condolence motion. Bob Dolan was a Labor great, a very passionate advocate for his community. My dealings with him directly were as a sort of a young Labor member, meeting him as a member of that famous Goss caucus in the late 80s, early 90s, and working around and seeing the commitment he had to his community and to his beloved timber industry. And that came to a sharp and difficult point at a point in time when the Goss government was pursuing the policy of ceasing timber harvesting on Fraser Island, and the transition to Fraser Island becoming a World Heritage location. And that was challenging and difficult to members like Bob. But he saw the way in which the balance had to be struck. And he brought his friends and his colleagues in that industry along for the journey. He fought hard on behalf of that industry for the concessions and support that it needed for the transition. And he fought hard on behalf of his fellow AWU members, as he had been from his very early days as a timber getter, to work closely with getting the best outcome for that transition. A tremendous example of the way in which fundamental Labor values deliver transition in challenging times, and being founded on that was very much part of who he was from the community he represented and that old Labor families and tradition in Maryborough. And I particularly want to acknowledge that in the context of his family, and acknowledge his wife Verlie and his children Stephen, Stewie, Marie, Michelle and Katrina, and acknowledge Penny here in the gallery as well. And can I note on a personal note too that my late brother got a bit of an insight into that family atmosphere in the late 70s, when he billeted with the Hanson family on a cricket carnival up in Maryborough, and got brought into that very much that genuine Labor families network that was very much a part of who the Hansons, the Dolans were, and so many other important Labor families in the Maryborough region. Barley, Bob Dolan.
Members, briefly, I just wanted to remark that I recall Maryborough becoming a timber town again. You know it's a timber town when the local fire station is going to be made out of timber. And the member for Maryborough would know all about that. But also passing on my condolences and the condolences of my family. My father, Warren, served with Bob Dolan in the Parliament, and was actually the chair of the Rural and Regional Task Force under the Goss government. And I know that he spent considerable time with Bob and always respected him and his counsel. So he gave great service to the state. Members, can I ask that if you agree with this motion, to stand in your place in silence for 1 minute. Thank you, honourable members. Notifications and tablings. I call the clerk.
I inform the House of the tabling of a certain paper in accordance with the notification and tabling of papers document emailed to members.
Are there any ministerial papers? Are there any ministerial notices of motion? Are there any ministerial statements? I call the Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it's important to talk about improving the resilience of this state without talking about the need. It is impossible to talk about improving the resilience of this state without talking about the need to confront climate change. Extreme weather with more frequency and more severity are the symptoms of global warming. Even the Prime Minister has said Australia is becoming harder to live in due to the increased frequency and intensity of natural disasters as a result of climate change. Mr Speaker, not one of us can reverse global warming. It is going to take all of us, and our government is doing its part. Mr Speaker, a centrepiece of economic recovery is our $2 billion investment in renewable energy. Investing in renewables provides cheaper, cleaner energy. It powers more jobs and it creates more industries. And it supercharges our resources sector with the demand for new minerals. This is part of our commitment to achieve 50% of our energy needs from renewable sources by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Mr Speaker, I'm proud to announce our latest investments in renewable energy. $192.5 million for a large-scale wind farm at Wombo near Dalby, and the $170 million agreement to connect the Carrara and McIntyre wind farms and deliver power to the grid near Dalby. The Treasurer and Energy Minister will provide more details shortly. Together, these projects will provide 820 jobs and unlock 1.25 gigawatts of electricity. Mr Speaker, this is in addition to our partnership with Andrew Forrest to build Australia's first manufacturing site building the electrolysers to produce hydrogen. Mr Forrest's company has signalled a $3 billion investment in wind and solar farms in central Queensland. This is in addition to building one of the world's biggest hydrogen manufacturing facilities, adding another 300 jobs in construction and thousands more in years to come. Mr Speaker, this is our economic recovery plan in action. We promised to bring manufacturing back to Queensland. It's happening. Resilience, recovery and renewables are the ingredients for a better future for all of us. Mr Speaker, delivering reliable public transport is also a priority of our government, and it's crucial as we prepare to host the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games. That's why, over the last 5 years, we've delivered record funding for transport and roads, including $27.5 billion in the last budget. Today I'm proud to announce another major milestone for one of Queensland's most important rail projects. I can confirm that work has begun on the $550.8 million Beerburrum to Nambour upgrade at Landsborough. This project will duplicate tracks on the North Coast Line, ease congestion on the Bruce Highway, increase freight capacity and improve services between Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. Mr Speaker, this will change the lives of thousands of people throughout southeast Queensland, improving services for commuters from Caloundra to Landsborough right through to Nambour and Palmwoods. This major upgrade will ensure that we're ready to welcome thousands of visitors to the southeast in time for the 2032 Olympic Games. Beerburrum to Nambour is also vital when it comes to rebuilding our economy and creating opportunities for local businesses. I'm advised that Hall Contracting, a local company, will complete early works. 10 workers will start the job this week, Mr Speaker, but this number will grow over the next 3 months as we move towards heavy construction. In total, the Beerburrum to Nambour upgrades will create more than 300 jobs for local workers throughout the life of the project. But, Mr Speaker, the Beerburrum to Nambour is just the beginning. We have Cross River Rail, the Gold Coast Light Rail Stage 3, works to progress heavy rail connection on the Beerwah to Maroochydore section, our Logan to Gold Coast Faster Rail Initiative and our historic train manufacturing program in Maryborough. No matter where you look throughout the state, we're investing in important public transport projects to cut commuting times for Queenslanders. Mr Speaker, on this side of the House, we are delivering for Queenslanders. And we're delivering for the Sunshine Coast because we have 2 outstanding members on the Sunshine Coast, Mr Speaker, that work hard.
They go to committee meetings.
They go to committee meetings, Mr Speaker. They do their job. They do their
Order! Premier, you have the call.
It's just starting, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our public transport system was hit hard in the recent weather event. In the last 2 weeks alone, thank you, Member from Maroochydore. I'm talking about things that are actually benefiting the Sunshine Coast. That's right. That's right. Delivery.
Order. Leader of the Opposition.
I was provoked, Mr Speaker. Provoked. Mr Speaker, in the last 2 weeks alone, workers from the Department of Transport and Main Roads have conducted 188 safety inspections on flood-impacted bridges, delivered 194 tonnes of plant mix to repair potholes and keep inland freight moving, and helped to reopen 1,000 roads. I can also confirm that today our rail schedules across the state are back to normal following the devastating floods here in the south-east. Well done to everyone involved. That is an outstanding commitment. I'd like to thank the thousands of engineers, tradespeople and labourers across Queensland who worked around the clock to make this happen for our great state. Mr Speaker, we know that to create jobs and rebuild our economy, we must invest in new infrastructure. I'll continue to fight for Queensland's fair share of funding for roads and rail. And finally, Mr Speaker, next month will mark 4 years since the Gold Coast hosted the 2018 Commonwealth Games. What an event that was! That we delivered a fully integrated para-sports program for the first time, equal number of medal events for men and women, the first regional Australia city to host games. I know they might not want to talk about the Commonwealth Games because at one stage they wanted to cut the Commonwealth Games. But we delivered it. We got on with the job, delivered it, built the infrastructure.
Order.
That's right.
Please, Premier, continue with your ministerial statement.
Thank you. And the fact that we actually hosted the Commonwealth Games so well actually had the spotlight of the International Olympic Committee on the southeast, Mr Speaker. If it wasn't for the Commonwealth Games, there would have been no Olympics, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, we also had 6,600 athletes from 71 nations and territories competing in 22 sports. This is not offensive.
Member for Nanango will cease her interjections. Premier, you have the call.
Grow up.
Okay. Order. Premier, can I ask you withdraw that remark? Can I ask you to withdraw that remark? Please continue with your statement.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And who could forget the incredible sea of blue... I did. Mr Speaker, and who could forget the incredible sea of blue and yellow game shaper volunteers
Members to my left.
who made the event possible. Successfully hosting the Commonwealth Games, as I said, was a critical part in Queensland securing the Brisbane 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, which is going to be, of course, on a much bigger scale. Mr Speaker, at the 2018 Commonwealth Games closing ceremony, I said in my speech this should be the model for all games to come. And then the Commonwealth Games flag was passed to the Lord Mayor of Birmingham. It's their time now. And I'm pleased to say that the Queen's Baton Relay, which traditionally starts at Buckingham Palace, has now reached Queensland shores to start its Australian leg. It was at Broadbeach on the Gold Coast this morning, the former host city, and this afternoon it will make its way to Parliament House with athletes Riley Day and Ebony Gorinku will also be attending. We'll also have there, also present will be the Governor, yourself, Mr Speaker, the Opposition Leader, the Minister and the Shadow Minister for Sport, and, of course, the Consul General. The baton is only here for one day before heading to Sydney. It has to move on. It's travelling 140,000 kilometres over 269 days, with over 7,500 baton bearers visiting 72 nations and territories of the Commonwealth. There's 133 days to go. Mr Speaker, I welcome the Queen's Baton Relay to Queensland once again. It's an exciting time for Birmingham in the lead-up to their Commonwealth Games, and I wish them all the very best for an incredible event.
I call the Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Yesterday I wrote to Senator Bridget McKenzie seeking priority funding from the Australian Government to upgrade Queensland's rain gauge and warning network as part of the 2022-23 federal budget. The Palaszczuk Government will share half the cost of the ongoing operations, maintenance and asset replacement of the flood warning system.
So, ladies and gentlemen, that has been the opening of the Parliament, the sitting of Queensland Parliament on the 17th day of March. We will, if time permits, after our daily India report, we might be joining in towards the question time today, time permitting. But right now we will end this segment, and very soon we will be coming with our daily news update and the daily India report. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining in. We'll see you in the next segment.